next speaker I'd like to introduce is Anna Bird. And Anna and David just swap places. I know some people have got to scoot out for seminars, no problem. Anna is the Head of Policy and Campaigns at the Fawcett Society, which I'm sure she'll explain a little bit more about. But she'll explain a little bit more about in a minute. So Anna oversees the design and delivery of Fawcett's passionate, informed campaigns for women's right at work, at home and in public life. Anna's campaigning activity currently focuses on two key areas: tackling women's economic inequality and challenging woeful underrepresentation of women in the UK's political system. I saw Anna speak at an event in Liverpool on the Equality Act, and I was ever conscious that I was looking for speakers for the Diversity Festival, and as soon as I saw Anna speak I said I need that person for my Diversity Festival, so I'll hand over to Anna. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the system of equality law and what's in it for women. I have to preface my presentation with the fact that unlike presumably everybody in the room, pretty much, I don't have any specialism in equality law or in law at all. I'm a passionate fan of equality law, if that helps, but I'm definitely an amateur. What I'm going to be talking about is actually how to apply it and how equality law is important not just in the courts and not just for lawyers, but actually for campaigners and for policymakers as well. So, to get started, as Catherine said, I work for the Fawcett Society. We're a tiny charity, just 8 people, but we are the UK's leading campaign for equality between women and men. And we trace our roots back 150 years to the peaceful struggle for women's votes. And Millicent Garrett Fawcett is the reason we are called the Fawcett Society. And as Catherine said, our vision is of a society in which women and men enjoy equality at work, at home and in public life. And our current campaigns focus on 2 key battlegrounds, which kind of emerged after the general election last year. Firstly, it was the economic condition we're living in, the current austerity climate, if you like, and the impact that will have on women's equality. And that's what I'm going to be focusing my talk on today. But secondly, we're also launching this year a major campaign around women in public life and looking at, I don't know whether you remember the general election last year, but there didn't seem to be that many women on our screens, and trying to tackle the absence of women in our political system, because that matters in terms of what decisions are made as well as us not being represented. In terms of what I'm going to talk about today then, I wanted to just give you a quick rundown on why equality law is so important, so a background to the gender gap, if you like, and in particular looking at economic inequality. And then I'm going to talk through, if I've got time, I will talk a bit about equal pay and Section 78 of the Equality Act. But certainly I'm going to major on the public sector equality duty, so very helpful that David gave a run through of the provisions. I'm going to talk about why it's such a crucial tool for policy making, and how Fawcett has used the equality law to challenge what we consider to be bad policy practice, and how we are continuing past our budget challenge to do that. So just to set the context really, I think it's important to restate the reasons why equality law exists, because I think it's too easy to forget them. The reason is that there are experiences and obstacles that we all face that evidence the need for there to be a law that levels the playing field between different groups of people. If I start by looking at the gender pay gap, first of all, as context, we know that on average women across the UK earn less, own less, more likely to live in poverty, more likely to have less financial control over their resources than men, on average. So in terms of the pay gap, we're looking at 40 years since the Equal Pay Act was introduced in the UK, but the pay gap still sits at 16%, so women earn, on average, a sixth less than their male counterparts. At Fawcett, we calculate that in a way that says that, on average, women stop getting paid on the 2nd of November every year, when men continue to be paid right up until the 31st of December. There are 45,000 women in the UK at the moment taking equal pay cases because they believe that in their place of work, men in their workplace are being paid more than them for similar work. There is also the case of the glass ceiling, so women struggle to make it to the top, And if you look at the FTSE 100 organisations, the board members, only 12% of board members are women, and that influences the way those businesses are run. At the moment, equality law, the equal pay law certainly, puts the onus on women to challenge discrimination. It means that women have to find evidence that they are being paid less than men in their workplace, and then challenge their employer, which is a particularly difficult thing to do if you want to keep your job. And it's a difficult process that women are reluctant to take forward, and there's obviously evidence that legislation has not done enough to tackle the gender pay gap. But the wider context of economic inequality, it's not just pay. We know that 2/3 of low-paid workers are women. Women are more likely to work in part-time jobs, more likely to work in insecure fields of work, more likely to be lower paid, and more likely to live in poverty. 40% of ethnic minority women live in poverty. Retired women earn less than their male counterparts. And women, because of all these reasons, are more likely to be dependent on the state, so more likely to receive state benefits to boost their income, and more likely to be in receipt of public services. On top of that, then, we're looking at a climate where we're seeing cuts to public services, and the current coalition government's economic policy really is taking the decision to reduce public spending and the welfare spend in particular, rather than increase taxes or find money in other ways or boost growth. The impact of that, we believe, will be felt directly on women's equality. And we've identified what we're calling a triple jeopardy of cuts. So women are facing cuts to their jobs. So 65% of the public sector workforce is women. So as we see cuts to public sector jobs, those are women that are losing their jobs disproportionately. Where will they go? What will that mean for women? We're also seeing huge cuts to services and benefits, and what we know, as I've described, is that women are more reliant on those services and benefits than men. What will that mean when services and benefits are there to support women and to equalise the playing field, if you like? So the kinds of services and benefits that are being cut are maternity payments, the support that women use to, particularly lone parents, to go out to work, housing benefit, which 1 million more women than men access, childcare services, healthcare services, domestic violence and sexual violence services. All of these are seeing massive cuts to their budgets, and that will obviously have an impact on where women sit, I guess, in our economy. We're also concerned, I suppose, this is the third concern, that women will be expected to fill the gap. So women already provide more care in the home, more care for older people, more care for children, but also kind of provide more of that volunteering, I suppose, than men. And as services are rolled back, we're concerned that that will have an impact on women, who will have less time, more responsibilities, and find it harder to go out to work, harder to have that public, to be equal in the public sphere. So we're really concerned that actually, although we have seen an incremental progression of women's equality over the past generation, actually now we're looking at a situation where women's equality could be rolled back. Okay, so that's the context. That's my rabble-rousing speech. Now I'm going to turn to equality law, and I will just touch very briefly on Section 78. Section 78 of the Equality Act 2010 sets out to introduce gender pay audits, and what it does is it talks about, it focuses on large companies, and it requires large companies with over 250 employees to undertake gender pay audits to look at how much they pay their men and their women, to do a comparative analysis, and to take action if they find that there's a disproportionate, there's a pay gap. It was quite a weak clause, if you like, in that the clause was not due to come into force until 2013, so 3 years from when it was supposed to be introduced, and it would only ever have been introduced if voluntary action failed. So essentially what it did was say to businesses, if you don't get your act together within the next 3 years and look at how you pay your employees and check there is no gap simply between what you pay men and what you pay women, you will be required to do that, and you will be required to take action if there is evidence that you're discriminating. The important thing about gender pay audits was that it put responsibility on the employer to tackle the pay gap. So rather than women having to find that information out for themselves and then take a claim, it put the responsibility on the employer to take action proactively. It was only ever if voluntary action failed that the measure would be brought in. But there is a kind of understanding that what gets measured gets done, and if you've got a measure in place that asks businesses to look, then that will have an impact. However, the government has decided that it's not going to commence that part of the Equality Act. It actually says that it's not going to commence, enact or repeal Section 78, which is a bit like putting it on a dusty shelf and leaving it there. It's kicked into the long grass, but it hasn't disappeared for good, which is interesting. However, we see it, Fawcett Society sees that as a huge step backwards, because actually it sends out a signal that the government is not interested in putting the onus on employers to take action. Voluntary action has failed. What we were going to see was a new lever to push for voluntary action, and even that has been removed, and we're concerned that that really is a step backwards. We're also concerned that we need to understand the context of what we're seeing in terms of public sector job losses. We know that women are paid less in the private sector than in the public sector. Women are losing their jobs in the public sector as a result of the public spending cuts, and the expectation is that those women will find other jobs in the private sector where action on gender pay has not been forthcoming. So we're really concerned that this is likely to see the pay gap widen. But as I said, the clause isn't gone for good, and Fawcett's going to be campaigning to change the status of the Section 78. It's on that dusty shelf, bring it back out and make sure that it does get enacted in the future. But what I wanted to focus on today was the public sector equality duty. Fawcett believes that it is absolutely a crucial tool to improve policy making. And what it does is it sets the framework for making good policy decisions. Importantly, it asks policymakers in the public sector to sorry, let me just find my page. It asks policymakers in the public sector to have due regard to the need to advance equality and to eliminate discrimination. What it does is focus not on the content of policy, so it's not asking the government or local authorities, the town hall, and it's not prescribing what policies are going to be brought into being. What it says is, you need to think about, before you bring in any policy, whether it's going to have a disproportionate impact on women and men, for example, or different groups. That's important because it's a bit like the Green Cross Code. It's not saying you shouldn't step out into the road. It's saying before you do that, you need to look both ways. You need to think about what's, the impact you might have if you walk out into the road and there's a big truck coming. And it also requires public bodies to take mitigating action. So public bodies can, if they want to, look at the impact of their policy, decide that actually what we're going to do, we're going to cut childcare services. We know that that is going to have a disproportionate impact on women. We're going to do it anyway, and we're going to explain why we're going to do it anyway, but they have to have good reason why they're going to do it anyway, and they might need to take mitigating action. So we're going to do it anyway, but we're going to help people who have childcare responsibilities by this other policy and that other policy. Okay, so that's really helpful in terms of encouraging good practice by public bodies, but it's also really important for us campaigners because it allows us to be able to fight for our rights. It essentially makes public bodies accountable, and it sets out reasonable expectations that we can use to assess government and council decision making. It also provides us with a tool to challenge unfair decisions if expectations aren't met, and that's where I want to talk about what Fawcett's been doing and with our budget challenge. We've been using the equality law because we feel that the coalition government's economic policy has been discriminatory. It hasn't looked at the impact on women and men. So just to give you a bit of context, the emergency budget was brought in on the 22nd of June last year. It outlined cuts of £19 billion to tax and welfare. The House of Commons Library did some analysis of the cuts and looked at kind of where those benefits benefit cuts were going to fall. And it identified that 72% of the cuts would come from women's purses or women's incomes. And that study also omits, it doesn't include within it VAT, which we also know has a disproportionate impact on women. So effectively with VAT, it's a standard tax on goods. People who have lower incomes are more likely to pay more of their income out on VAT because they pay more of their incomes out on goods, essentially. And the House of Commons Library research also didn't focus on the public sector pay freeze, but we know that the pay freeze will affect more women than men because more women work in the public sector than men. The Institute for Fiscal Studies also did some analysis of the emergency budget and identified that the poorest will be hit hardest, but of the poorest, it will be lone parents that suffer most. And we know that 9 out of 10 lone parents are women. So in particular, this will hurt women more than men. So what did we do? Well, we launched a judicial review, but we weren't launching a budget challenge based on the fact that we didn't like what was in the budget. We were concerned not that the economic policy was skewed towards men, but actually because we felt that the government had not looked to see where the axe would fall. And so I suppose what we were saying is we're not politicians, we're not economists, but we do know that there is a process that you should be taking forward, which is looking at the impact of your policies before you go ahead. And there was no evidence at all that the government had undertaken what we call a gender equality impact assessment, had looked at whether its economic policies were going to hit women's equality. It was very much about process. It wasn't about the content, but it was about the government not taking due regard to its responsibilities. So what happened with our court case? Well, we weren't successful in court. The judge ruled that the case, we had a permission hearing. The judge ruled that we shouldn't proceed to a judicial review. However, the reason for that was he argued that it was academic, that actually all that we could hope to achieve at this point, we couldn't bring down the budget, and that's certainly not what we were trying to achieve. That would ruin capital markets and send the country into a spin. But what we were trying to do was get a declaration that the government had acted unlawfully, and that it would have to, in future, improve its practices. And the judge ruled that actually we weren't going to get anything more out of our case because the Equality and Human Rights Commission had already launched an investigation which was going to look at the same thing, and the judge felt that in the spirit of good public spending we shouldn't take the court case any further, and that was fine with us. But what we did achieve was, I think, really important. So in court we got we managed to concede from the government. The government admitted that it had not undertaken a gender equality impact assessment of its budget. Of 101 different measures that it tried to introduce, that it did introduce in the budget, it had undertaken an assessment of how women and men would be affected in only one case, and of the other 100 it hadn't looked at all. We also were pleased to see that, as a result of our case, the government, when it brought out a spending review in October, the government did actually produce an equality statement, had done some analysis, and we see that as a step forward. So using the equality law, challenging the government's practices actually has improved practice already, although we don't think the equality statement is up to scratch, of course. But I think more crucially, our action did launch the Equality and Human Rights Commission's investigation, and more broadly, I think it's raised awareness of the law and the risk to women's equality of where we are today. But it's not just in court that equality law can be used, and I think crucially, what we're trying to do now, building on our judicial review, is to use the knowledge we gained out of that, the understanding of how we can look at the impact of economic policy on women and men, to exert pressure on policymakers and on politicians to improve their processes, but equally also to help them to devise good data sets, good ways of analysing how different groups of people might be affected by their policies. We're also working directly with economists to produce better data, so to understand, for example, when benefits are paid to a household, who gets that benefit, who pays, is it the, for example, the wife or the husband who takes that money, and therefore we can better understand the impact. We're also working with journalists to improve debate and using the principles behind the equality law to ask journalists to ask the right questions. So when they hear about the latest government policy, are they asking who's going to be affected by this, what's behind the policy, and what will be the unintended consequences, importantly. We're also supporting women to campaign against the cuts, so using the principles that we used in our budget challenge to support women to take cases locally, not take cases in the legal sense, but to use the law to challenge government, local council decision making, to ask the right questions. Have you done an assessment? What was the analysis? What was the data? What do you know about local need and how you're spending your money? And that's something we're going to be taking forward over the year ahead. You can find out more. That was a huge whistle-stop tour, but I've got a train to catch. So it was really fast. But there's more information about all of this on our website. And if you want to get involved, please do go to our website, check us out. We're also on Twitter and Facebook. And you can email me if you want information. There probably is time for 5 minutes of questions if people want to ask questions.
Anyone like to ask Anna any questions?
Once they actually implement spending review and these provisions start coming into force, are you intending to maybe take some action on individual aspects of that, or have you taken the action as far as it can go, really?
Well, in terms of the legal action, that was very much about the process that policymakers went through. So it wasn't on kind of the, it was there to try and affect and encourage better policy making. I think when the cuts start to bite, there's another job that needs to be done, which is about collecting evidence of where women are particularly affected or where different groups are particularly affected, and supporting local action to challenge the decisions that have been made. And so we're going to be producing campaigning tools and all of that kind of stuff. We're going to be helping women by explaining the law and nationally bringing some of that pressure to bear on government to explain what the impact is. I don't think it will be a legal challenge at that point, but I think we're not a litigation charity in the end. But certainly to continue to mount the pressure on government to understand that all of these decisions have a really important impact on people, and it's not just on individual women or men or disabled people, it's actually on the status of equality in the UK. So we're looking at a situation where, yes, individual people will be hurt, but actually overall we're seeing a slip back in our expectations of our life opportunities, really.
I've got one.
Oh.
I was wondering if you've done any lobbying of particularly women MPs in the coalition government, and what kind of response you got from them, because presumably they might be able to put themselves more in the situation of women and the equality sort of issue.
Yeah.
Does that put any mileage or not, do you think?
Yes, to some degree. I think that there is more sympathy among women MPs, the problem being that there are very few women MPs in the coalition government, and certainly in positions of power. And when we look at how the decisions were made about economic policy, you'd notice that there weren't any women around the table. And there's a saying that we've been banding around a little bit, which is that if you're not around the table, you're on the menu. And very much the situation was, if you look at the Star Chamber, the public spending committees, there weren't any women at those tables, and I think that has had an impact, and it's something that does need to be addressed. We are working with women across parties, absolutely, and sympathetic men, of course, and there is sympathy, but I think overall, at this point, where have we got to? Yeah.
I was just wondering if having the public sector equality duty rather than just the gender equality duty, if you're worried that that will water things down a little bit.
Yeah, we do have some concerns that the public sector equality duty represents a dilution of the gender equality duty. In some ways it's stronger, so the general duty talks about advancing equality, which is stronger than what we had under the gender equality duty. But the specific duties which are about publishing information, gathering data, are weaker. And they talk about, and I think what we've seen is, as David said, bringing all the legislation together and producing a public sector equality duty that brings all the strands together. What they've brought in the legislation is that public sector bodies can decide which of the protected characteristics they're going to focus on, and so it's possible that some groups will be left out. And of course, it very much depends on kind of the quality of the data that's gathered, and I think as well the interests of the people gathering the data and the interests of the people taking forward the equality programme within each public sector body. So, yeah, to some degree there is a dilution. Certainly the gender equality impact assessment part of the legislation which we took our case on won't exist in the format that it does at the moment. So.
Great. Well, if everyone could join me in thanking both Anna and David for the first 2 sessions of this morning, that would be lovely.